In the Bible's story of creation, the first thing that God created was light. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. I like the take that comedian Ellen DeGeneres had on that. She said there was still nothing, but you could see it a whole lot better. At least after there was light, God could create other things that could then be seen. There's a sense in which the creation of light was the venue for all of the other things that God created. And since God created the universe for human beings, and in order to be in relationship with humans, there's a sense in which we could say light is what makes possible the relationship between God and humans. In that same story of creation from the Bible, after God created the light, God then divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day and the darkness night. Oftentimes in the Bible, darkness is used to signify a separation between God and humans. Darkness is a way of describing what happens when we can't see God, when there's a disconnect between ourselves and God. The prophet Isaiah described God's people Israel at a very low point in their history by saying, "They are the people who walk in darkness." In the Bible, darkness is not the equal and opposite of light. Darkness is simply the absence of light. Those of us who grew up watching Star Wars might have a different picture. In Star Wars, there's this magical energy field running throughout the universe. It's called the Force. It can be used equally for good or for bad, for light or for dark. We see the heroes of the movie on one hand using the Force to rescue someone in danger. But we also see the villain using it to choke a guy from across the room. In the Bible, darkness is simply the absence of light. At one point, Jesus said, "Those who want to do things who know they shouldn't be doing them usually do them at nighttime so that no one will see what they're doing." Darkness is the absence of light. I had a really good friend in university. He played on our school's tennis team. He was a great athlete and a great tennis player. In fact, he wasn't just the best player on the tennis team, he was better at tennis than anyone else at the school was at any other sport. I remember one day I ran into him, and the side of his face was all black and blue. I asked him, "What on earth happened to you?" And he said, "I rode my bike into the side of a building." This was surprising. This guy was a tremendous athlete. He had strength and balance and coordination. If anyone had the ability to avoid riding a bicycle into the side of a building, it was this guy. I asked him, "How on earth did this happen?" He said, "It was late, and it was dark, and I didn't see it. And he'd had a few too many adult beverages." Darkness is what happens when we can't see the things that we're meant to see. In today's Bible story, Jesus encountered a man who had been blind since birth. Ever since the day he had been born, he did not have the use of his eyes. He couldn't see anything. And the disciples were perplexed. They asked Jesus, "Why is this man blind?" Now, we might think of that question as a medical one. What is the physiological problem that keeps his eyes from working as they are meant to? But they meant it as a spiritual question. They were wondering if there was a spiritual reason that he was not able to have the use of his eyes, some reason that God had taken his vision away. And John, the gospel writer, wants us to see that his lack of physical vision was a symbol of the lack of spiritual vision possessed by God's people, Israel. And this is why John wants us to know that Jesus is the light of the world. Jesus is the one who restores a lack of spiritual vision. Jesus' life and teachings shine the light of God's love into a world which is dark without those things. And in the same way that at the first creation, light created the venue for everything else to be created, and therefore for humans to be in relationship with God, so Jesus brought God's light into the midst of the world so that that relationship between God and humans might be renewed and restored. There's a wonderful development in the story that we heard. Jesus spit on the ground and made a little bit of paste, and then he rubbed it on the eyes of the man who had been blind for his entire life, and he told him to go and wash in a particular pool of water outside Jerusalem that was known for its healing powers. And the man did so, and instantly he could see. Even more than this was the way that his spiritual vision was returned. It's not just that now he could see with his eyes. Now he had a spiritual vision as well. He said, "No one has ever done anything like this. If Jesus was able to restore the sight in my eyes, then he must be from God." This is the spiritual vision, to see the light of God's love coming into the world in Jesus. And even more than this, his restored vision becomes a symbol of the way God's people enjoy new spiritual vision. Others who were around the scene began to put their faith in Jesus. Surely he must be from God, they began to say. Even some of the Pharisees who were officially opposed to Jesus began to recognize that he was a prophet or a messenger who had been sent from God. And because of who he was and the things that he said and did, they began to recognize that it was God at work in their midst. They had a new vision. It was like they had seen the light. It reminds us, of course, of the story of John Newton. Some of you must know it. Some 250 years or so ago, he lived in England, and he began his working career as a sailor on a slave trading ship. Now, by all accounts, including his own, John Newton was a real lowlife. Even the slave traders and those who worked on the slave trading vessel couldn't stand him. Later in life, he became a Christian. And he became a saintly man. And he became a Christian minister and a writer of great hymns. And this person who at one time no one could even stand to be around wrote some of the most famous words in the English language. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. You see, Jesus brings the light of God's love into our world. And we can see things which previously we were blind to. And what we see is wonderful. Now, some of those who were around Jesus and the blind man whose vision had been restored preferred to stay in the darkness. Some of the Pharisees, for example, the opponents of Jesus, they were convinced that because Jesus had done this little bit of work on the Sabbath, the day of rest, that he could not have been from God, that it could not be God at work through him, because God had given the law of the Sabbath, and that was the last word. It was as though they would prefer that Jesus had not even healed this man on the day of rest. In fact, they began to interrogate the blind man once his vision had been restored, and they tried to pester him to change his story. And when he wouldn't change his story, they told him to get lost and to never be in their presence again. Just as God's creation of light became the venue for the rest of creation, and therefore of the relationship between God and humankind, so Jesus brought God's light into the midst of our world to renew and restore the possibility of our relationship with God. Jesus' life and teachings show us the light of God's love, which shines in a way that all are invited to see. I once heard a fellow named Gary tell a little bit of his life story. He had been a young man living in Vancouver. And he was a really active, sporty kind of guy. And then one time he was playing squash with his friend, and he was getting absolutely hammered on the scoreboard, and he wondered what was wrong. And then next thing he knew, he could only see his opponent from the waist up and only out of one eye. He was rushed to the hospital, and it was found that he had a detached retina. And at the time this happened, he was rushed into emergency surgery. And the technology of the day, the follow-up healing process to retinal reattachment surgery, was to lay on your back for 3 straight weeks in the dark with bandages around your eyes. He's only allowed for 3 straight weeks to get up and go to the bathroom. Otherwise, he had to lay on his back in complete darkness. And throughout that 3 weeks of laying on his back, he was not sure whether or not the surgery was successful. And so for 3 straight weeks, he lay on his back, having to contemplate the possibility that he would never see again, that his eyesight would be lost for good. And he said that period of waiting was at first the darkest time in his life. Everything he took for granted, everything he held dear, his lifestyle, his future, all cast into doubt. And yet he said over the course of the period, something amazing began to happen. He began to reflect and to listen, and began to have conversation with God. And by the end of the healing period, he had reached the point where he was able to say, God, if you want me to go through the rest of my life as a blind man, I will still serve you. And so while he was laying there in the dark with bandages around his eyes, unable to see a thing, he began to see the way the light of God's love was shining in his heart. Now, as it turned out, his surgery was successful, and he did have sight restored in his eyes. But it is the sight of his heart to see God at work in faith which has guided his path. And he has been a light to many others. We may or may not have good eyesight, but we can all have spiritual vision. I think, for example, of Muriel Stevens, a longtime member of our church who died a few months ago. For the last few years of her life, she did not have the use of her eyes. She couldn't see a thing. But she was a person of deep faith and deep spiritual vision. God's love has come into our world like the dawn. And we see this light in Jesus. May we have such spiritual vision in our hearts, and may that vision be a light to our path. And as we walk along that path, may we reflect Christ's light, that we might shine for others and illumine their path as well. Our next hymn is 266. We'll sing together verses 1 to 4.